All righty, thank you everyone for your patience. I'll call the Finance-Auditing Committee to order on this May 23rd. And if we could have roll call, please.
Thank you. Starting with Director Dorsey, who's absent. Judice.
Here.
Grosball is absent. Hernandez. Thank you. Maston is absent. Verdoni is absent. Vice Chair Parr. Chair Rabbit.
Here.
And President Cochran.
Here.
Thank you. You have a quorum. You are not a committee of the whole. Also in the room, we have Directors Hill, Moulton Peters, Theriot, and Thier, so you can feel free to have them join the committee so that they can also comment today.
Yeah, no, please, everyone, join right in. We'll move on then to item number 3, which is ratification of previous actions by the Auditor Controller. That's on pages 5 to 22. The PFM report starts on page 9, and I know that we have Monique Spike with us from PFM to report out. It's good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Interesting times in the investment world. I'll start with some of the good news, which is that interest rates are back in an elevated position. Some interesting things in the market. What we had essentially dealt with the last few months is an inflation number that was a bit higher than anticipated. Now recall the Fed had been expected to start cutting rates dramatically this year in anticipation of inflation cooling, thinking that we sort of at the end of the process. Because the inflation trends were higher than anticipated, we actually saw the Fed step back from that a bit and speak about being patient. That caused interest rates to rise in the portfolios. Now, the good news for the district is that that has allowed us to continue taking advantage of more elevated interest rates. Over the past few months, we have done so by buying longer-term bonds in the portfolio. We've taken some of the cash that has been accumulating and investing out, and we're really happy with that trend. We have also been going directly to dealers in the negotiable certificates of deposit market, one of their CDs, and taking advantage of rates in that market as well. And so again, good news for the district is that we're seeing higher rates. We are locking in those rates, and the portfolio should have more income on a going forward basis. With that said, let's shift back to the economic outlook. Now, the Fed has reiterated time and time again that they will be patient. Some of the concerns in the market. One, inflation is not behaving as anticipated. 2, we have a lot of outward forces that could cause more price pressure. One being climate change. 2, being geopolitical tensions around the world. And another consideration sort of outside that box is that a lot of the supply disruptions that occurred during the pandemic and shortly after have for the most part been resolved. So the issues we're dealing with today are issues that could be persistent. Climate change is affecting shipping. For example, there have been disruptions in shipping through the Panama Canal due to drought and low water. When you look at geopolitical tensions resulting in shipping, the Suez Canal has had issues where there's just been disruption in that part of the world, causing shipping delays. That's caused shipping prices to elevate about 170%. Furthermore, we have the consumer. So consumer spending started to soften. Consumers make about 70% of our GDP. We're starting to see the consumers are not only pressured by rising goods prices, as we all know, but we're also seeing things higher housing costs. Single-family homes are beginning to rent more often, and those rent prices are going up. Apartment prices are also going up. Millennials represent a large portion of the potential house buying public, and quite frankly, they're simply not buying, they're renting. And so that's putting a lot of pressure on shelter prices. And I know this all sounds like really dark and bad news, but I just want to give you a sense of the outlook and what the Fed is dealing with. Other things in the housing market is the fact that insurance costs are going up significantly for homeowners and owners across the country. Now, what does this mean? This means that there exists some pricing pressure in the economy that the Fed has to manage and monitor. So although there's a sense that, they should start cutting rates, all of these additional pressures in the economy in the world are requiring them to be a little bit more cautious. The unemployment picture is still fairly positive. Unemployment rate has been below 4% for 27 consecutive months. I don't think it's been that great since I followed statistics that said the Vietnam War. But interestingly enough, Chairman Powell was asked about the possibility of stagflation, where inflation is out of control and the unemployment market starts going high again. Now, in the Bay Area, we've built a lot of layoffs in the tech sector and the corporate sector. That has not been the case necessarily across the country. There is some concerns that if consumer spending slows, continues to slow as anticipated, we may see more layoffs. So the Fed is really trying to balance all of these considerations together. Now, what does that mean for the outlook for interest rates? Well, we are way past the expectation that we'll see a dramatic amount of interest rate cuts this year. What the market is now predicting is that we may see a cut in September and perhaps another cut at the end of the year. But given all of the economic news and concerns, the Fed is being very cautious and really communicating to the market that they will move their plan if required and necessary by the markets. So our outlook in terms of the investment portfolio is we are not relying on interest rate changes going up or down in any sense. Really focused on is what we see in front of us, which is very high interest rates. So we're trying to lock those in. We continue to keep an eye on diversification of the portfolio as a whole. And we think that that combination of locking in yields while we can and diversifying is going to put the district in the best position to weather whatever happens in the investment markets over the next year. That was a lot.
But like you said, there's a lot going on, and it's a really interesting time. So very much appreciate that. All my colleagues, to see if there's any questions, comments, or concerns. And the good thing for the district is that while we're making on our returns, which is always a good thing, especially with the current financial situation, getting back to that or to our previous B&O meeting, with projects coming forward, it also means we're going to be spending. I personally believe, especially in construction, that it's probably gone up about 40% in the last 3 years. I don't know if anyone else has seen this, but I think there's almost the COVID disruption. I think businesses adapted, made less products, charged more, had less overhead, and I think they were happy with that and haven't gone back. It seems to be, there's certain electrical components that they're a year out. You just need to wait, and you need to pay what they charge. And there's not the competition out there. I know even Simpson clips used to cost 69 cents. Now we're $4, and there's no reason that should be that high. But I think they just adapted to this, and I do wonder if that'll come back to the pre-COVID days, or they're happy with.
Yeah, I really believe that prices are sticking on the downside. Once the consumer has adapted to the higher price point, it is almost impossible to get producers to voluntarily roll back the clock. I feel like Costco's a standout in my mind as a business owner who thinks about that. But prices are sticking on the downside, and absent a federal legal mandate to do so, we're not expecting those prices to come down. And then you add in the additional pressure point on prices for suppliers. There's some potential there for increased inflation, which is why the Fed is, using words like flexible and patient, and we'll see.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for the report. And is there any public comment on this particular item?
We have no speakers from the public on this item.
So this is an action item. I will look to my colleagues to accept the report.
So moved. Second.
We have a motion and a second, and we do voice vote?
Yeah.
We can do a voice vote. So all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Is there anyone opposed? Please say no. Hearing no opposition, that does pass unanimously with all present. Thank you. Thank you. Quick note, no actions for item number 4, so we'll move on to 5A, which is authorize the filling of applications of FTA Formula Program and Surface Transportation Program funding for transit capital projects, commit the necessary local match for the project, and assure completion of the projects. That's on pages 27 to 30. Amy Fry is here to give us a brief presentation
Good
or
morning,
answer
directors and Chair Abbott. Yes, the item before you will authorize the general manager or his designee to file a grant application with the Federal Transit Administration and the Federal Highway Administration. The grants will support critical transit projects, including bus and train replacements, infrastructure improvements, and maintenance programs. Since 2022, MTC has supported the region with multi-year programming for federal formula grants. And staff has returned to this committee each year to appraise you of the changes that we've made in the programming for the district. This item outlines a couple of amendments, including a reduction to the planned bus replacement to align with the district's current service levels. The district plans to replace 5 of the 23 buses that are eligible for replacement this year, and an increase in the allocation for a ferry rehab project. Note that we will be able to replace the remaining 18 buses in the future, depending on the district's needs and funding availability. These amendments are described on page 2 of your item, included in the table on page 3. It gives an overview of the 3-year program. Separately, this is for information only. Staff recently received a green light from FTA to reprogram some funds that are existing to the San Rafael Transit Center relocation project. And this would allow the district to start the federal environmental process and streamline that process for the project. The fiscal impact of the amendments to the district's 3-year federal programming would result in a reduction of approximately $10 million total, 8 of which are federal funds and 2 of which are district funds. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you, Amy. Anyone have any questions on this particular item? Seeing no questions, I'll look for a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second.
So we have a motion and a second, and again on a voice vote, or is there any public comment on this one?
We have no public comment on this item.
So with that, we'll take a voice vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Is there any opposition? Please say no. Hearing no opposition, that says pass unanimously with all present. Amy, why don't you go through 5B, which is to authorize the filing an application with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission for fiscal year 23-24 Regional Measure 3 operating funds to support the express bus services.
This item will authorize the general manager to file an application with MTC for fiscal year 24 Regional Measure 3 or RM3 funds, and they will support express bus services in the amount of $2,181,768. MTC has indicated that RM3 allocation will change annually and will support public transit sustainability efforts. The region has about $24 million that accumulated during the time that RM3 was undergoing several lawsuits, and MTC will coordinate with us and other operators to allocate those funds. Future allocations of RM3 will be part of the annual payment process, in which we apply for multiple fund sources, which include the Transportation Development Act, which is called TDA, the State Transit Assistance Act, also known as TDA, Regional Measure 2, RM2. So those are, RM3 is adding to those in our annual claim. And we will bring an item to you in July to address the annual claim and to allocate those funds with your blessing.
Thank you, Amy. Questions on this? Anyone? Any public comment?
No public comment on this.
I'll bring it back and look for a motion to approve. So we have a motion and a second. Again, voice vote. All those in favor, please say aye. Is there any opposition? Please say no. Hearing no opposition, that does pass unanimously with all present. Thank you, Amy. Appreciate all the work. Moving on then to item number 6, which is approve actions relative to capital project number 2213, the business intelligence analysis and transportation statistics reporting solution into contract number 2022-D067, the transportation statistics reporting system and implementation services. We have Ron Downing
Good morning,
to give us
Chair,
an update.
members of the committee. Paul Lou is also with me today, and she will go over some of the specifics
Great.
of the contract. Just to give you a little bit of background, the project at hand was awarded by the board to Transite LLC back in March of 2023 to replace our homegrown transportation data and statistical analysis package known as Transstat. Transstat was modified many times over the years and got to a point where it just wasn't worth investing in putting more Band-Aids and all kinds of glue on it to keep it moving. And so the board agreed to award a contract to a new firm who's been working with Transite for just over a year now. And one of the challenges that's arisen is we have a number of reports that come out of the current Transstat system that Transite assumed that we would just want to replicate entirely as they were. And now that we're in a position to do something bigger and better than Transstat, we need to do a deeper dive on what these reports were, and Transite didn't really allocate enough resources for what we call the needs assessment, as far as going through these reports, talking to the different operating divisions as to what the needs were, and really doing a deeper dive. So we brought in some consultation services from a firm named 49s that worked with us many years in patching together Transstat. We're here today to ask you to consider a project increase and a budget amendment, a contract amendment to the current Transite project to basically make us whole for the work that's been going on. We've actually spent project contingency to some of this additional effort, and we think we're in a good position to move forward. We've done deeper dives, like I said, with bus and ferry divisions as well as finance to try to get this in the direction that we want to be moving in. So Fong is here and she can talk a bit more about the specifics of the budget requests, and I will turn it over to her.
Great, thank you.
Chair and members of the committee. As Ron mentioned, during the initial phase of this project, we discovered the need for a needs assessment. So today, before you, we're asking for approval of a budget increase for this capital project, which is capital project number 2213. Is this intelligence analysis and transportation statistics reporting system. We are seeking approval for capital project increase of $670,711. Actually, almost half of this money was for this labor, so the number was not as big as it appears on the paper, if you will. We also, among the $670,000, we're looking for authorization for the execution of the second amendment for contract number 2022-D-067 to add $27,600. We're also asking for some additional contingency money. This is also for contract number 2022-D-067, and we're asking for an increase of $19,387. So staff did a lot of quality work with this complex project. We are pulling data from different sources. We also want to make sure that we have precise calculations for all these data that we're pulling for the reporting purposes, for BI purposes. Staff also was mindful with the spending of the project as a matter of fact, we were able to find some cost savings for licenses that won't fully utilize, for example, the tablet licenses, and we were able to repurpose that use for this BI project. Did a lot of work with the numbers. I understand there are a lot of numbers in the staff report. Did our due diligence, and all the numbers breakdowns are in the 3 tables toward the end of the report. We presented numbers in the aspect of the project budget, contract, as well as the PPs. So happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay. Any questions? Seeing no questions, I will ask, is there any public comment on this particular item?
We have no public comments on this item.
I'll bring it back to the board and ask if there is a motion to approve. Good motion and a second. Again, voice vote on this particular item. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Is there any opposition? Please say no. Hearing no no's, that does pass unanimously with all present. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Moving on to number 7, authorize execution of 7th Amendment to contract 2010 D1 deferred compensation plan provider with Mission Square Retirement. Joe?
Yeah, thank you. To Sharon, to the rest of the board. This is a deferred compensation. Last month, or the month before, I think it was last month, came before you talked about the program itself. In that report mentioned that we would be extending the current provider's contract. The deferred compensation program is a program that the district runs that employees contribute their own funds to fund their own decision-making process. And there's about $120 million of our employee money is included in this particular program. And the reason I mentioned that is when you have $120 million of your colleagues' money's investment, it's a pretty high bar on whether or not you want to change what they're doing. Because if we change the provider, it changes the process they use to invest in everything they invest in. And they all have to redo it. So we've been, over the years, working very diligently with this provider to be the best they can be. And which basically includes, and what we lay out in the support, that we're looking for more training, less cost, and more guidance, and hopefully make that as low guidance as low cost as possible. That's where you go to get a financial person to sit down and be able to work on your investments if you choose to do that. This particular provider, Mission Square, has over the years done that. They have, you can see in the tables, they have repeatedly lowered their pricing. We're now down to 0.042% of administrative cost on investment. We have hired and we've had worked with them for more than a decade, a professional financial advisor that comes with us also, and they see this company and other companies working with a number of their clients, and so we know through their analysis that ours are low, that we've been able to do that. So we make the recommendation that you renew their contract for 5 years with 2 1-year extensions.
Thank you, Joe. Colleagues, any questions on this one? Seeing no hands raised, there's no public comment.
No public comment on this item.
I'll bring it back. Ask for a motion to approve.
So moved. Second.
A motion and a second. Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Is there any opposition? Please say no. Hearing no opposition, that does pass unanimously. Thank you, Joe. Moving on to item number 8, initial presentation of the proposed fiscal year 24-25 operating and capital budget. Joe.
Yes, thank you. Again, I'll just say I recognize that you guys have already been here several hours. This will take a little bit of time. It won't be too long. And I will be here for the rest of the reports too, and I will make sure that they will open. So once this one's done, the rest will be quick. This is, I always take a very, I guess now we call it low-tech approach, which is the book. Now it is online, and some of you probably have looked at it online. I will be using the page numbers that are in the book. They also are on the copy online if you'd like to do that. If you need a book, I know we have it here now.
Hang on, we got it. It's okay. We got it.
All right.
We got it.
Thank you. And if you have one, if you already revealed one at home, you want to leave this one, that's fine. You'll recycle
That's
it
right.
to someone else who would be happy at a written book.
No, don't
This
complain
is
about paper.
the budget for next year, just the process real quickly. We'll talk about it today. This is May. It'll come back to your finance committee in June. And at that finance committee meeting, you would then if you have more questions, we can talk about it, but the idea would then you make a recommendation for us to take it to the full board in June, and then they would consider action in June. Opening up the book, on the first page, we do a little bit of glad handling. There's Dennis's name's on there, my name's on there, but the real work falls to Jennifer and Amy back here and their staff. And Eric, who's back in the corner, and Lauren and Chris on my staff. The five of them really do the bulk of the work on putting it together. And then, of course, at the very bottom, we know that the data in here, of course, comes from the hard work of our DGMs and officers that sit behind me and their staff to get us the data to it. So it's very important that we recognize them. It is a lot of work. I know we developed this, but it's one of my staff who's no longer used to say, it's publishing an entire book. Don't you expect it to take a lot of work? Yes, it is. A 100-page book. And it is a lot of work. So anyway, next page, that would be page 2. We have been, I think, 18 years in a row now recognized as by the public, the GFOA, which is our nation's Government Financial Officers Association, is having a distinguished budget, and we can keep seeking that, even though they change on us occasionally. We keep seeking that award, and we have been able to get it. So that's another congratulations to the staff for that award. Now, taking a look at the table of contents, which starts on page 4. The only reason I mention that is that you can see it's extensive. It's 2 long pages. We're just be talking about stuff in the first 3 sections. After that comes a section for each of the divisions, and in there is a lot of material that's detailed and related to a particular division, British Western Ferry, the district division. I encourage you to take a look at it. We just don't have the time to go over it. The one section, there's a status section, bridge status plus division status. That's where your GGMs have actually written about what they're doing or have done, a little of both. And that I recommend taking a look at those. And if there are any particular questions there, they are all happy to talk to you about those things. It's, of course, still online. Also, appendices, there are 2 that are important. One is, they're all important. There are 2 that you might want to look at. One is the 10-year capital plan. That's all the projects that are coming down the pipe over the next 10 years that we know about today. And that's in Appendix D. And Appendix F is the projection that you received earlier this, well, it was late last calendar year. And that's the yearly projection. That's sort of the hurdle that we're all looking to overcome. This budget is part of that process. Moving on to the general manager's message, which is on page 9. It's a message. It's also kind of state of the district. I looked at it over this time and talked about it. Dennis does a very good job of writing it up. But for all of you, it's stuff that he's been telling you, and we've been telling you, and I've been telling you, and you've been here. And so it's nice in that way. It recaps it all in just a couple of pages. It's familiar, and it shouldn't be. There shouldn't be any surprises.
He said it's funny how that all works.
It is. It's our job to keep you guys informed. Your staff's job to keep you informed as a board. And when I look at this, yes, we've been talking about this over and over again. Clearly, the first couple of pages are the district's operational challenges and financial challenges we've been facing. And we've been open and talking about that repeatedly, and it's a nice summary of those that talk about those. And then it talks about what we're doing to overcome those challenges. Seeking revenues from other sources, from the federal, from the state, from MTC. It talks about the strategic plan development. So if the full board, the board has been working on, the full board has already looked at it and will be considering again tomorrow. That's talked about it here. And then lastly, at the very end, it talks about several other large projects and accomplishments that occurred. And that would be, completing the continuous suicide area and Millgate Bridge, not completed during this last year. It was the report, which I wasn't aware Ava was going to do this detail, which she did earlier on the site retrofit. Of course, the beginning of that project, which we've all been talking about for more than 20 years to get to this point to this project. So the beginning of the steam sheet cartel was a huge accomplishment for the district and moving forward. So encourage you to take a look at, to spend time on that general manager's message. We will move on to page 18, which is sort of the financial part of this budget. It's the first section. And the lay of the land is we start out with a big picture, and then we talk about the finances, and we talk about the budget itself. in summary, and then each of, in the end, are those 4 division sections where we talk about the actual budget of each division. So it kind of starts from large, it gets smaller and more detailed as it goes through. Looking at page 18, first paragraph is important, is it basically says, the budget sets your strategic direction, sets your priorities. It's an implementation tool for the board and the staff to implement those priorities. The budget is not a surprise. This is not like you read about in a movie or hear about in a movie or reading a newspaper where so-and-so brought their budget and they have a whole new thing in there that no one knew about. We don't do that in this organization. Everything comes through the board process, and the budget puts it all in one place and helps implement it. But it's not trying to create some new things. Doesn't mean there might be few little things here and there occasionally, but there's no big change in direction, and that's not what it's intended to be, and that's not what it is. So you should rest assured that comfortable to know that things that you hear here, you should recognize from work that we've done. It starts out by, this section basically introduces the district as saying, we are in our 5th year of, not necessarily knowing as well as we used to know about what's going to happen. We have a good track record of post-pandemic time now of 3 to 4 years of relatively steady growth. So this budget, that'll continue and shouldn't be a surprise. We think that a little relative steady growth will continue. No shooting up, to some new height that we didn't, we're not expecting that, and we haven't seen that, and we're not really going to predict that here. If getting down to the bottom of that page 18, the budget is $318 million this year, and that's both budget, operating, and capital. The operating budget is $238 million in revenues, and then $34 million in use of district reserves. And we will talk a lot about use of reserves as we go through this process. Capital budget is $20 million in government grants to fund that on the revenue side, and $26 million from the reserves. From the district. And then looking over on page 19 at the expenses, it's of that $318 million, 272 is operating, and 46 million is capital. The preponderance of it in this particular year is in the operating budget. That is true for most years, although when the semester project gets going, it's going to look a little different. For the first time in history, probably the district. But going back to the 1930s when everything was capital. And looking on page 21, look at that a little bit graphically. There's a table and then a pie chart next to it. The important thing just to point out here is, we have one very large slice of pie in that. That's the totals. And they create half of all of the revenue that we have, both operating and capital. And totals are important for both because almost all of the matching monies we use to match a grant comes from totals, whether it's for the bridge or the bus or the ferry. So it's important, those totals cover all of those things. The next largest piece would be the reserve funding, and that's the it's both red and green here. It's about 19%. And then we have what's called government grants. And those are operating subsidies that we receive through Marin and Sonoma counties for transit service, and they also are some capital grants that we most of those come through MTC that we achieve from both the state and federal government. Capital projects. Looking at the bottom of the page are the expenses, and I just wanted to point out there is the operating, as I mentioned, is the large blue piece and the small gray one. So operating is about 80% of the budget, and then capital is the other 15%. So primarily this year, it's operating spending that's driving our expenses. Moving on to page 22 is a long table that's had for many years. It covers provides different views. Some of it is, it gives you a 3-year look, sort of how actually 23's actuals, 24 actuals, and looking at 25. But also what it does is it gets at the district funding. The far right-hand column, starting at the top and going down, talks about revenues first, then your expenses, and then you come down to the bottom. It's the fact that the revenues are less than the expenses, and that's at the bottom of that first table. That's the $60 million. And we're in the brackets, which means negative. You don't have it. But we do actually have it. It's in the reserves. And we're going to be taking it out of the reserves to spend. And that's the $34 million for operating and the $26 million for capital. And then what the second table does at the bottom is an important one that typically usually shows, you can see from earlier years, that our budget would have a positive impact on the reserves. It means we're trying to grow the reserves, put money in the bank for future capital projects. And the reason we do that is, we own this 80-year-old billion dollar bridge that we need to maintain, plus all of the rolling stock we have for our transmission and all of their facilities. And so we're a very capital intensive organization, although, of course, we just saw the budget is primarily spending on operating. It's really going to be, it's capital over the long haul. It's going to be the biggest expense for us. So this particular year, the budget doesn't grow the reserves, and that's because of the operating expenditures. The budget is expecting $60 million out. If you look at that bottom table on the far right-hand side, it's going to add back into reserves about 36 million, almost 37. So it's a net of about 24 coming out. It's unusual. We don't usually have, and that's because of this use of reserve money to cover our capital expense, our transit expenses, operating expenses. And the reason that we're recommending that is that, if you remember, I'll take a step back for a second. If you remember that the MPC has stated that we are in line to receive, this budget has $2.8 million in it that's coming from MPC. This is coming from the state bill that was passed last year. But then next year we're supposed to receive $38 million. That most likely will be sufficient amount of revenue to run the district next year without going into the reserve. So this is sort of a bridge. You're spending some of your reserve money to get to that next year. Now, and then MTC in the region is working on further funding in 26. That potentially could come through in 26. And then that would be the year following that. So in theory, additional revenues may accrue to the district. If they don't, then the staff and the board would need to work together to reduce the expenses or find some other source of revenue to meet this. Because as I'll say later again, I'm sure, the spending from your reserve for operation is not a long-term strategy. That money long-term needs to be there for the capital. Otherwise, you won't have the capital resources to provide the service in the first place. So anyway, that's that reserve section. And as I said, we'll hit it again. The next page moves us into the district's financial situation. And I'll have you turn to page 24. And there's 24, 25, if you have to go open to see graphs on your page. The one on 24 is essentially the amount of revenue that's there that we've set aside in reserve for capital projects, or in this case, operating spending in the short term. And it's been increasing every year, except for the significant dip back when we made the contribution for what is now the Doyle Drive Freeway. It's been rising, and it's been rising because, as I mentioned, the need for those capital projects. On the right-hand page, or page 25, that talks about looking at how the money is going to be spent out. And as you see, the red line on that is the allocation of the money to projects, and it drops extremely fast this year because, and we'll talk about when we get to the capital budget, this is the first year that the Seismic District project actually hits the budget. It's been in the capital plan for 25 years. It's been sitting there, but it's now in the budget. Not that we're expecting to spend out of it, but as David mentioned, we're starting the CNG work already, and eventually that will cause us to spend money. So it shows up, and it's a big allocation, but it's not a big expense. As you can see, the blue line, which is the actual money spending, doesn't drop very much at all this next year. Well, it's because we're not really expecting it to. And then it starts to drop off as we expect the expenditures for the Seismic project and other capital projects to increase. The point of this is that blue line eventually crosses zero. And of course, we can't really run the organization that ever actually makes it to zero. We want to keep it from crossing zero. When you add money into your reserves, the years, that blue line gets moved out in years. When it crosses zero, it keeps getting moved out. Every time you put money in the bank, that gets moved out. If you take money out of the bank, which is what this budget is doing, it's going to move the blue in the other direction, which is closer in time. Only a little bit, but it's going to move it closer. And so our job over time is to keep moving it out, and the board's been successfully doing that for several decades. So with confidence we'll get there, but there is some hurdles to pass before we get there in the next couple of years. Let's turn to page 28. This is near and dear to my heart. This is the pandemic and sort of where we are today. That chart in the middle of the page, that graph, is one that is different than the ones that you receive regularly in the budget reports that you get to the Finance Committee, which we will talk about very, very briefly after the budget. And what this really shows is those are all the different years, starting in 19, going through 25. 25 is the dotted line, you keep going there. And this is our most important source of revenue. These are bridge tolls. And you can see 19, and what we've done here to make this more eye-popping, in a way, I guess, to do it, and I think more accurate, is 19 is, if we had the prices we had today, and we had traffic we had in 19, we'd be getting the revenue that you see in that blue line. That means we're charging today's prices for traffic we had back in 2019. Of course, we don't have the traffic today, so we don't get that, and that's what you see in your regular reports every month. Is you see what's actually happening, but you see there's a big gap in there, and the last 4 years and this year, they're all kind of rolling together in the middle. You know, that's good. We have steady income. It's good to have steady income. It's going up a little bit because we raised prices, but it's not back where it was. And it's really important to always remember that all, and you know, we're not offering the same level of service to offer either. So that's why our expenses are down. But right now, if this customer came back on a transit service and the customer didn't come on our bridge, we wouldn't be able to afford the transit service with any stretch of the imagination. We just didn't have the subsidy available to do that. There's similar impacts you can see in page 30 and 32 for the fares, but I won't go over there. Those similar to what we talked about before. You know, their rate is bringing about half the money that you would expect. What I would like to turn to is page 34. And the reason I put this one in is that page 34 is a graph that is sort of where the rubber meets the road for the organization. How much does it have available after it pays for the bridge expenses to spend on other things? And that other things traditionally has been transit service, at least since the 1970s. And you can see this, if you look in the far left-hand side of that graph, in 2014-15, there was almost $64 million. In 2023-24, that's the year we're just completing, we think it's going to be, $63 million. And this isn't, there's no inflationary change here. This is the fact that we have the same $64 million this last year, the subsidized transit, that we had 10 years ago. And as we all just got talked about from Monique's discussion, prices have actually gone up quite a bit in those last 10 years. So we cannot afford what we used to afford. And we're not getting it. And you can see that dotted line is our, quick guess at like where that subsidy amount, this is a chart of the subsidy amount, where that subsidy amount might have been if sort of the normal things have taken off. Of course, the normal thing didn't happen, so that's pie in the sky, but it gives you some idea of the gap that we're dealing with. And it's just important. This one's important because this is the money we have either to put in capital reserves or to put into transit. We do a little of both with it over the years. The same thing on the next page 35, is the same issue exists for fares. They're half of what they used to be, a little more, what they might have been. So they're also, the fares and the subsidy from tolls is used to be our largest single sources of revenue for transit. And tolls still are, fares are not anymore. The next question we do think, well, geez, how are we surviving? How have we survived? And that we've summarized on a chart, a table on page 37. And the short answer is the federal government passed those bills over the last years, and we've been spending the money from 3 different federal acts that gave out emergency funding to many, many organizations across the United States. And of course, transit was one of the recipients. So we received $287 million, and that appears in those dark totals in the middle of that chart on page 30, the table on page 37. It actually, take my word for it, adds up to $287.9 million. Those numbers are actually, we'll put that number on the left-hand side next to the total. But what it did create, what that allowed to do was fund expenses, and that's what the law was passed to do. In the district's finances, if we pay our transit expenses with the federal money, in some instances, we were able to put some of the toll money that we might have used to do that into our federal reserves to pay for future capital reserves or future operating expenses. So that is what's happened. So the bottom line is a cumulative total, approximately $89 million, give or take a little, because it's hard to measure this exactly, has transferred to reserve that probably would not have transferred to reserve if we had never had the pandemic and did not get those 3 federal acts and that money. And that money's available, it's in your reserves, it's just full money, the board, it's a policy all the board can spend it on its choice. It's not connected to any federal act or state or local. It's discretion of the board. And it's commingled. The district reserves are not sparsed out in any particular way. This money is running through your capital and operating reserves. And this budget, of course, assumes that potentially 34 million of that would come out and be used for. So we take page 38. This is a table we had in the budget for many years now. Essentially, I'll point to it. So it covers how transit is funded. And it was an important thing we told earlier that, of course, the toll subsidy is one of the larger sources for transit. It's covering transit expenses here. And that is the top line of those tables you see. The left-hand table is the current year, the one that's finishing next month, and the right-hand table is what we think it's going to be next year based on the budget. And as I said, tolls were always the largest single source. This year that's just finishing up, of course, they're not going to be the largest single source. We believe it's our third tranche funding. You know, there's money we got from the federal government's been bailing out the expenses. Subsidy from toll being the second largest. Next year, tolls will become again the largest source because the subsidies have run their course, and the federal government will have spent all of those resources at the end of this year. It'll account for about 38% of the subsidy, or $62 million worth. And then the reserves at 21%, or $34 million, the next largest source of revenue. These are numbers I'm looking at the far right-hand side of that table. And then come the ones, the typical ones. You get fares at 13%, all other revenues at 10%, and then our government. These are local sales, mostly local sales tax revenues that come through the 2 counties because we offer service in those counties, and we're in some counties. They provide some of their SDA and TDA to the district to do that. And so overall, that's how we'll be funding transit. The one last thing to point out on that is you notice how on what we call government grants is the SSCA TDA, they were approximately $29 million last year, and they're about $30 million this year. Many of our, those of you that serve on multiple committees, many of you will notice that our funding here for transit is slightly different because we use primarily toll subsidy, which is a different fee-for-service source. It's like fares anyway. Whereas most of our fellow transit agencies around the Bay Area are funded through other forms of taxes. And as you can see, even for the district, those forms of taxes like SBA, TDA, and local sales taxes, which the district doesn't have, they haven't really changed. In some cases, they've actually gone up. In our case, they've gone up a little bit. So although we as a transit district are still in a situation where we're suffering significant losses from the post-pandemic era, some of our fellow transit agencies are not in the same position because their main subsidy sources have continued to grow and have steady. And we're an example of that. If that was not just 18 and 20% of our revenue, but 80%, we'd be having a whole different conversation. All right, let's move on to page 41. And this is just quickly to say that each year the budget will include initiatives that it's working on in the strategic financial plan. And as you guys know, strategic plan, in the past, the strategic financial plan, the strategic plan. And this budget, if the board decides to take action on its strategic plan, either at its May meeting, which is potentially could, or later one in June, then we would take some of those initiatives and include them into this budget, and they would appear in this section. So right now they're not there because no action is taken. If there is action, it will be included. Just so you know. So it'll be there, and then of course in future years the same thing will occur. Let's move on to page 51. And we're going to move now from the large financial picture right down to the operating budget itself. And then we'll do, at the end of that, the capital budget, and then we'll be done. The operating budget, as I mentioned earlier, $272 million. That's listed on the table on the left-hand side, halfway down. That's the full line. And you can see from the pie chart next to it, the tolls make up even larger significant amount of the operating budget, 58%. Then we go to the operating reserve at 13%, and then those STTDA funds at 11%, and then fares down at 8%. And fares have obviously shrunk because we don't have the ridership that we did have at one point in the past. The chart at the table and pie chart at the bottom, just to recognize that about 60% of our operating budget is sent to operate transit. So as we've done for years, this is a transit division with a really important bridge that helps fund the transition. I'm turning to page 53, talking about the revenues, and I just want to give you some assumptions in case you get asked about these things. There's about $240 million in revenues, and then the remainder is made up of the remainder of the operating revenues. The remainder of the revenues are made up by the money coming out of reserves. That's a slight decrease overall from last year, and you think, why would that go down if we had a toll increase, which passed a few months ago, and we do have? It's because of the change in the market value of our assets that we hold. That Monique was talking about before. That market value went up. It goes down when the interest rates go up, and it goes up when the interest rate went down. So there, in the part of this year, the interest rates dropped, and we had a significant increase in our market value. We have to book that as actual. We don't actually. The district gets no money for that. We get our money from the actual coupon interest they pay us, but the council wants to book it. So we have $8 million. We earned $8 million in paper, and that showed up last year, but it won't show up next year because we're not expecting that to happen next year. Although now the rates have come back up, maybe they will go down next year. We don't budget movements in the market because it's not something we can predict. And so that large $7 million, $8 million offsets the toll increase essentially, and so it kind of wipes out that on paper. It wipes out, but not in real life, because toll increase is real money. Market value change is not. And let's talk more about that if you have any questions. We're looking at the major categories I mentioned. Bridge tolls, we're expecting a small increase in traffic, sort of along the lines of what's been happening over the last couple of years. And then we have a toll increase. So that we're expecting a $7 million increase. That's off. It would have been a little larger, but it's offset by a projected decrease in the violation toll revenue, and that's because there was a law that was passed last year that capped the amount that you can charge on a violation. So we dropped our amount in order to meet that law, and therefore we expect less money to come through that. Transit fares, we're expecting about $1.2 million increase in that, based on a small increase in ridership on both bus and ferry, about 5%, and that's less than what they've had the last couple of years. So it is kind of, we're projecting the traffic to kind of the rate, the slope, I guess we call it, the rate of growth to decrease a little. Doesn't mean it will, but we are being what I'd say is conservative to do that. And also there's a little bit of that money, that 1.2 million increase also comes from slight tolling fare increase that we passed. This will be the second year of that, and that was passed more than a year ago. Other income sources that we talk about on this page are roughly the same as I mentioned earlier in the chart, so I won't go into the details. They haven't changed. However, the next page, page 54, at the top of the page, is the investment income one. I just mentioned that the investment income was a significant drop. That drop, you can actually see that drop on page 55 in that table that's on page 55. Earned interest, which is interest earned, which is the top line of that table on page 55. It's the bottom of page 5. We're expecting $1 million next year. But the market gains and losses, which is, as I mentioned, paper, it's all on paper. We're not expecting anything next year. And this year that the total of those two was $20 million. Next year, we're expecting to be 11. That's a very significant drop. It rarely ever happens. It only happened because we have such a large movement in the interest rates, and we'll see what happens next year. Whatever does happen, of course, we have to document it, and Cody puts into your annual report that you get every November. Turning to page 57, we'll talk a little about the expenses. As I mentioned, $272 million. It's an 8% increase. Most of that is in salaries and expenses, and most of that is funding and employee positions that have been made this last year. So otherwise, expenses are projected to be relatively flat when you look through any other category except for salaries and expenses. And that is because that one is because of refunding positions that were vacant. The budget is about 2/3 salaries and expenses. That's why I mentioned it. Whatever happens there is going to drive the rest of the budget costs. It does include negotiated salary increases, which for right now is just your ATU group. Your other coalition group and other units are under negotiation today, and your non-reps you would handle at a later date. So it does not include resources for increases in salary. It includes all your pension MOU agreements, all the required contributions for all 4 of your pensions. It includes increases in medical costs that are, because our medical benefits are under contract, or you have them for your non-rep employees, and includes all the costs to afford those next year. Turning to page 59. Just like to point out, there's a section that starts on page 59, which talks about significant categories of expense. I'll just point out 3 of them as I go through, but feel free to look at any of them and ask me questions either now or at future, at this meeting we have in June or in between. First one to take a look at is it's on page 61. So the OPEB, and OPEB is the trust that was set up to pay for retiree healthcare benefits, anything other than pension. But we used it to pay for retiree healthcare. This budget fully funds the contribution to that trust. That trust is successfully funding the benefits of retirees and is about 70% funded these days. The next thing on page 61 is the cost of healthcare. And just to mention, I mentioned earlier, this fully funds the healthcare increase costs that are going to occur because of the benefits the district provides. But just remind that the costs are, going up, not going up, so they're lower than what we would have expected. And a lot of that is due to the district's incentive plan that is created that essentially provides district employees with payments, money, to pick a cheaper plan. And they have most of them have successfully done that. So the majority of our employees essentially have no net cost for their healthcare, because what the district pays them to incentivize them to pick a plan offsets the out-of-pocket costs they have and the premium share that they've agreed to in their contracts for the 66. There is a small group, less than 20%, that is a more expensive plan where they do have some out-of-pocket costs, and those are all listed in detail on the pages. And then lastly, on page 65, just to say the district, that there's a large table there on district pension contributions. The pension, of course, is something we talked a lot about last committee and the board over the last years. District will make about $26 million in pension contributions this next year. It's detailed out by which of our 4 pensions our employees are involved in 4 different pensions here at the district. And so that's listed on that page. All right, turn to page 66. We have a overall district table that summarizes the budgeted positions, and the change in those positions. It is really just one between the year end, and this budget proposes to increase that by 1 from 857 to 858. That's listed in the middle of the page. It's in the bridge divisions for an operating engineer position. So this is an action that the budget does ask the board to take, is to increase the stable organization by that 1 position. David can talk quite a bit about it in the questions, but it is essentially operating engineers are the support of all of the equipment that your painters and your iron workers and others use here at the bridge division, or to keep the bridge maintained in the condition it's in. So the workload, the number of projects increased, therefore the number of equipment is increased, therefore the workload on the operating engineering group is increased. So that's the short summary of that request there. The second thing to mention about budget positions here is the district has always fully funded the positions that you have in the budget in the past, and except for in one category, that's your bus operators, where we fund the workload. In other words, this is the service we expect to fund, and we fund that. We base the number based on the number of hours that are going to be worked, and that's how we fund it. And that's worked for the district for decades. This particular budget increases that slightly. We've taken some of the non-bus operator, there's a couple non-bus operator positions, about 20, 25, that the district has not funded because they are attached in some form or another to service the district has not been providing over the last couple of years in the transit divisions primarily. But they're in those service areas. And we have been funding them over the last couple of years, and I think I've used the words like this is an aspirational budget. You know, we may be able to hire these people back if the service goes up. It's been 3 years of that, so this budget actually says, no, we don't think we're going to actually hire those folks, and so we have not actually put money into the budget to hire them. However, their positions will remain if, in fact, the service need does come back. The staff will come back to this board and say, you know, in fact, we do need to hire positions, and we need to put some more money in the budget to do so. But after a number of years, it just didn't seem like prudent to keep doing something that wasn't actually coming to fruition. Okay, turning to the next page, the capital budget summary. This is page 67 of your budget. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the capital expense about $46 million is divided. $20 million will come from federal, state, local. The other 26 are reserves to match those federal, state, and local grants. There's 74 projects in the budget. They are listed in detail in the next couple of pages, and then in much more detail in each of the divisions. So if it's a bridge project, you go to the bridge division, et cetera, and you can get to them. But they're listed just in detail on the next couple of pages. There are 80 new projects, 50 continuing projects, and the 4 capital equipment projects. Those are the projects we have in there just by and large items for the various divisions. 49% of the money is expected to be spent out through the bridge division, 21 in bus, 20 in ferry, 10 in the district. That's not an abnormal, that's relatively normal kind of spread. Sometimes the bridge is even a little larger, depending on what's going on in the transit division. If you look at the table in the middle of page 68, capital expenditures by division, the second row from the right, second column from the right actually listed the numbers, and you can sense it. 20 million, 22 million going out in the bridge division, and then et cetera as you look down the page. As I mentioned, all those projects are listed in detail in the sections following this. So let's turn to page 74, the last page of the capital budget section, and that's what's called the capital budget project list. There are 6 projects here, and we started this about a decade ago, and these are projects that the district staff believe are ready to move forward. However, there aren't the implementation resources and primarily staffing resources to carry them forward at this time. So they're put on the list, and the district board would be asked to allow the general manager to start one of these projects if, in fact, some other project that's in the budget either finishes early or for some reason is delayed, which happens in capital projects. They get delayed for some reason, then they can start one of these instead, just to keep that going. So resources available to start, and there are 6 members to do that. I mentioned that is the short summary of the budget. The rest are chapters that you look at. I would like to point your attention to the board item, though, just to take a quick look at the recommendations, so you'll be familiar with that questions. And those are listed on the very first page of the board item. That in your packet. Essentially, you're authorizing the district goals, objective capital reserve, the reserve structure, table of organization. That's that one position I mentioned. It authorizes that you're going to meet your contractual obligations in the ATU, and that you're not getting paid increases to the other groups. It authorizes the capital contribution that you're making to move monies from reserves. and then authorize some other actions, and they are essentially to keep business going. In other words, any action the board takes between now and the end of the year would be included into the budget, even though it's not sitting there today because we haven't taken the action. One is, for example, strategic plan. It also authorizes the district to carry over any incomplete project, capital project. It authorizes the general manager to that thing I mentioned about project list, to move a project from the project list into the budget if time is available. It authorizes district staff to make any budget transfers that need to comply with the board policy. This, as I said, will come to the board, the committee in June. It's your finance committee meeting for any discussion we might want to have, or questions you might want to have, and then with the recommendations taken to the board in June. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Joe. First off, just thanks to you, thanks to your entire staff for all the, and to really all the divisions for putting together the budget. Very much, we know there's a ton of work behind it, so thank you, first and foremost. I'll look to my colleagues. I do have a couple questions. It seems to me that while every budget is unique, what's unique about this year's budget is really the use of the reserves or the lack of the fulfillment of the reserves. So my questions really go to, and I admit I should probably already know this, we always talk about district reserves. Do we have separate categories for capital and operating? Do we have a policy of, I know in our county, the operating reserves is 2 months operating and so on and so forth. I would imagine on the capital side, I guess my part of that questioning would be, are we dropping items off because we're not keeping up in this annual contribution?
Good, several. So yes, the district board has a policy, and it's in the budget, and I think I skipped over that page. You have an emergency reserve and you have an operating reserve, and they're budgeted at a percentage of your total budget. And I think one is 7.5% and one is 2.5% or something like that. So they would be the first place you would go for resources to fund a shortfall. They were intended to fund a year where you're a couple $1 million one way or the other because things didn't work out exactly as you planned. I wouldn't say that's this year. We knew years ago that this year was coming and that we would most likely have to use the reserves to do this. But we have reserves set aside to do this. And then in the next year, you would then refund those operating reserves. All the rest of the money that's available is in a large capital project reserve. It's not specified for a particular capital project. And that's given the board the flexibility to move around the projects because projects cannot be predicted exactly how quickly they're going to move and how quickly money is going to spend out. So you haven't like some places they designate this, and you have 74 different designations for these projects. We don't do that here. We keep it open and the money goes out, and we monitor, your staff is monitoring that all the time, rest assured, because we don't want to get to the point where there isn't money available, but we're not designated at the board level in that way.
If I could add a little bit. So we're in our post-pandemic glide path. So the question is, does bridge traffic act faster than transit ridership? But we're on a glide path, and this makes it perhaps look a little steeper than it is. And the reason why is Congress allocated COVID relief money. And kudos to Joe and Cody and his whole team. We don't want a new Congress saying in January taking all that money back that's not spent. So we spent all. And so let's say we had $100 million we needed for transit. I'm making up numbers hypothetically. And we had 50 million of tolls, and we had, I needed 50. We could have expensed 50 million of this COVID relief money. We spent the whole 100 million, put the 50 million in the reserves, so Congress can never take the money back when Congress changes. So the reserves, that one item Joe showed you, the 89 and change, that's money that we set aside in reserves that we would have otherwise spent on transit. So that money could be used for your glide path, could be used when the engineering department has an updated estimate for the seismic retrofit project next March. But so, we do have money in our reserves that could be used for a glide path, and perhaps that was the intent of Congress. But you'll have decisions, and Joe and his team will be bringing you decisions at various junctures over the next couple of years. So, but we are on a glide path. That reserve money arguably is COVID relief money, but you may want to save that COVID relief money for other challenges.
No, and I appreciate that. I know that we had talked about that. And I do think it's wise to spend federal money, that's before there's you always want to make sure that you maintain the most flexible of the monies going forward. So I do appreciate that. I just wanted to just note that to me, that is the biggest change in this budget as opposed to any other budgets that we've had in the
As I
past.
mentioned, we would be having a different conversation about reserves, use of reserves, if we weren't expecting the MTC to follow through with the monies, the $38 million next year from the state. That, because it creates a kind of, it creates a little donut. So we have this 1 year where we don't have enough resources, and then we're gonna have enough in the next year. So we didn't want to just like drop down our service for our expenses for just 1 year and then increase them the next year. So that's one reason why you see what looks like it is a large amount of money being spent out of the reserve.
And traffic could look different in 2 years, positive or negative.
Yeah, 2 years is a long time from now.
So, it's a glide path. And the MTC allocation, Senate Bill 125 money was huge. We're one of, I think, 5 or 6 agencies in the area that received an allocation. And that was based on our need. They looked at our books and said, you got money.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And then, before I go, I just want to, there was another piece on that. Oh, on the allocation list. So again, that one chart shows total positions, but is there another chart that shows total funded positions? How does that 859 total positions? And you mentioned that we're keeping some positions open, but not funding them. So where would that be in the breakdown by division?
We can provide that to you.
Okay.
No, we have not, because it has not been I'll just explain, because it's not been a tradition for the district to have an unfunded position in the budget outside of the bus operators. Because we fund them on a more FTE basis rather than a position basis. We haven't had that chart in the past, so we didn't include it. We can do that.
I think it'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
We'll do it by division.
I know in our county, again, because of the difficulty in hiring post-COVID, I'm not sure if the other entities have this. We used to have a 1 year. If it wasn't filled in a year, then you sweep that off because there's always the play of fund balance and then where that goes and how. But the 1 year was actually too short to fill some positions because of the.
We can provide them by division.
And what we've done, we've intentionally kept some positions vacant because there's not a need. We don't need to have all of our bus operators, all of our mechanics, all of our ferry staff filled. But as customers come back, we're hiring. Our next bus driver class will have 15 candidates in it. So we intentionally kept them vacant because we didn't have the need for them. And that also affects some of the administrative positions where positions vacant. We said, let's try to get by for as long as we can because we're trying to keep expenses down because revenue's coming in or down.
Director Giudice, I know you had
Thank you. Well, first of all, the level of narrative here was amazing, and it gives us a lot of good information where we can now go out and explain to the world what is going on. So that's really important. But just to the general manager, were you alluding to the fact that if the bridge traffic comes back quicker and better than the bus and the ferry, that is a better cash position for us?
Clearly, yeah.
Just want to make sure I got that.
Everyone that crosses the bridge in an automobile gives us money more than we need for the bridge. Everyone rides a bus or a boat costs us money.
Right.
So when we offer less service, that actually saves money because the fares are only covering a portion of the cost. So we've been very judicious about adding back transit service as much return. And transit customers are coming back each month compared to the same month a year ago. It goes up. And so it's prudent for us to be adding back staff.
So that's the goose that laid the goose today.
Yeah. Director Hill.
Got a question. I remember 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, we were talking about individual electrification on the system, large amount of spending. How does that fit in within this budget?
It's baked into your budget. An earlier item today, our grants manager, Ms. Amy Fry, talked about some grants that we want to have the board authorize. And as part of that, we'll replace 5 buses next year. Those buses that we'll be purchasing will be battery electric buses. The rate of our replacement though is slowed down because we're not utilizing all of our buses at the same rate as before. And so we don't need to replace quickly, which is also very helpful for us as we get the available grant funds that are available in the region. So we are embarked upon a path. The California Air Resources Board has deadlines. And so as buses age out, when we replace them, we will replace them with zero emission buses.
And replacement time is time and not miles.
The minimum, there's a minimum that FAA will not participate in the cost of replacing bus unless it's at least 12 years old. But if you can run a bus a little longer before you replace it, there's benefits to that. And we have excellent maintenance staff, so we commonly run our buses longer than the 12 years. So we have plans. I planned before the pandemic we were replacing buses much faster. Hence the more than 2 dozen number that Ms. Fry referred to in her presentation. But the reality is we only need to replace 5 of them now because we're not fully utilizing the fleet. And how quickly things accelerate or decelerate is based on customers' return. So in essence, on the bus side, we're operating all of our regional bus service 23 hours a day up and down the 101 corridor and across the Richard Santa Fe Bridge. It's the commute piece not come back. People in the North Bay seem to prefer working from home in their pajamas and commuting to San Francisco. And that's something we don't control. What we control is our reaction to it. So that reaction is how we scale up our bus ferry service and also how we time our capital replacement purchases. So we've slowed down capital replacement purchases on the bus side based on the real need of the organization.
President.
Joe, thank you for the presentation, but I'm just kind of curious, page 26, when we set a $25 million reserve to self-insure ourselves, very top of the page, we've never added a COLA to that 25 million. Is there a reason for that? Should we have been increasing that all along?
Yeah, no, it's a very valid policy call to make. We also have not necessarily decided to stop at 25 million either.
Well,
There was no big decision there either. So I think that was something that was coming to us because we're just about to the 25 million now. And so we'd have to face that question, and it would be something I could bring to a future finance committee meeting to say, what do you guys want to do? I'll be clear that when we picked the 25 million 15 years ago, or whatever, it was kind of a nice round number.
Well, it was.
And we might want to think about that, like, what does it really mean? Yeah.
$4 toll rate also.
Exactly, yeah. What for everybody else, what the intention of this $25 million was if something happened to the bridge and we were not able to collect tolls for some period of time, that there would be some money we could immediately get access to, that we would have, that we could pay salaries or keep the bus system or whatever it is for a series of months as we got that toll collection process back up, or the bridge, whatever needed to be repaired. But it was always meant as a short-term stopgap, not a long-term, because if something major happens to the bridge, this doesn't do it. It's just enough to keep us going, pay your bills, do some things like that. And it was also started back in a time when your reserves were, $6 million. You didn't have the reserves that you have today back then either. And you won't have the reserves you have today tomorrow when you get that seismic pressure project run either. So they'll run down again, back to something not as low as what it used to be, but something lower.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions? Is it safe to say, just talking about the reserves and that I was trying to find that chart where it goes below zero and that's 2 years out? But that's exaggerated, right?
Well, it depends on which line. The allocation we do is just like.
When you take into account the
Spending
size
is
of
like 3 years out.
The blue line suspend down, and the blue line showed 20.
Yeah, like 27 or something.
27.
Yeah.
And if you go back to last year's budget and the year before, it always shows it.
Yeah.
Because the board keeps making responsible decisions to keep that a couple of years out.
Yeah.
It means you have more hard work ahead of you.
including state participation.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, the intention of that graph when I first made it up was to just bring to people's attention that this is an important concept. Hopefully not to scare anybody, but to scare them just enough to know that you must, as a board, maintain your reserves and maintain the assets that you have. And that's just part of our job here.
Well, job well done, because
Yes.
red ink and lines below zero.
Yeah, I don't have to go.
You draw
Let me just say, just point to it, say, so you don't want that one, and it has, Dennis is right, if we had a little more,
graphic skill here. We have something up on the graph that shows that line moving out over time, over all these years, because it's wandered. We've kept it a couple years in front of us for years now, which is great. Again, and I don't expect it to be too far in front of us. A couple years is enough. It's not like it's trying to push it out 10 years.
So again, looking at my colleagues, any other questions, comments, concerns? Is there anyone from the public on this particular item?
No speakers on this item.
So this is an action item?
It is not.
It is not.
It is not.
It's the
It'll come
first,
back.
the first look.
Yeah.
Yes.
So now we'll move into the rapid fire
Yes.
session.
You can just give them all to me if you want. I'll just go right here.
Take them away, Joe.
Take them away. Well, I mean, I know there's public comment.
We'll take the public one at the end, so we'll let everyone know to roll it in.
I don't want to get in the way. All right, so page 47 is your next report, and that's the status report on the 23-24 budget. That's the current budget. I'll just say that it's still balanced using the federal one-time funding. And we'll move on to page 57, which would be your report on patronage and ridership. So if you have a chance to look at that one. Page 57, usually what we look at is the chart that's on page 59. And I did want to point out that one, and Dennis mentioned that in our interior senior staff meeting, is that this month for the bridge traffic, the first month since the pandemic, when this particular month of April was actually less than the month of April the year before. It was 3%. There are a lot of reasons why that could have happened. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a trend that we need to worry about in the future. However, if this happened again next month, or if it goes back to 0, let's say next month, but not +2 or 3, then you got to think that we really maybe are flattening out that slope. We don't know. It's too early, but it's the first it's the first time it's happened to do that. Bus and ferry, bus look just the same growth rate they've been having. Ferry's growth rate was less also, but that's even more suspect because baseball and other things come in. I don't even know how many games they have or didn't have in April this time, and they can change. That can change a lot of their numbers in the summertime. Or a couple nice days versus bad days. Could have been a couple nice days last April, who knows? But it was lower than the trend that's been going on. So just something we will watch, and we'll talk about it again next month. Let's turn to page 65. That's your finances, and the key point there is the total on the front of page 65 in the middle, and the bottom right-hand corner of that table is still a positive number. That means through 10 months, your your income as an operating group has been greater than your expenses as an operating group, and that's not what we predicted. We predicted that those would be your expenses would be greater. It hasn't happened yet. So we've got 2 more months to go. So things are good. I mean, that's a good sign, and that's a sign we want to see going forward into the future. That would, of course, roll over into future years if this keeps happening. And to get to what Director Judy said, that means probably that the revenue coming out on the bridge has been enough to make up for on expenses on the bus side. Exactly. And then the next one is page 75, which is your capital expenditures, and they're at 80% through 10 months, which is just fine. Pretty much on target. So nothing to bring to you there. And that is the end of those reports.
Thank you, Joe. Questions on any of those reports? Anyone? Seeing no question, we'll move on to hybrid item 12, if we can, which is public comment to this body, plus public comment on any of the last items that Joe just spoke.
We have no new callers that have joined the public line, and no one's raised their hand to speak since the beginning of the meeting, and we have no one in the public in the room that would like to speak, so we have no.
All right, with that, motion to adjourn? So we have a motion and a second, and I'm not hearing any opposition, so we're